Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. I'm Austin Tichenor from the Reduced Shakespeare Company.
And I'm Gary Andrews, known as Gary Scribbler from the Internet Place.
From your World Wide Webs.
My World Wide Web. I'm from everywhere, apparently.
You kind of are. And today we are welcoming a very special, esteemed, scholarly guest, the director, I hope I'm getting this right, of Education and Research for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, Mr. Paul Edmondson. How are you, Paul? Thank you for joining us.
Austin and Gary, I'm very well. It's great for you to have me on your show. Thank you.
It's great to see your face.
Yay.
I remember being delighted at one of those. It was on PBS here. It was at Shakespeare Discovered, Shakespeare Rediscovered, whatever it was. A documentary films about Shakespeare by plays, and suddenly there you are on my screen in my living room as a distinguished talking head.
Yes, that was a lovely series, that PBS series. They came to Stratford and they interviewed me in the birthplace, and they interviewed me in Holy Trinity Church for one of them as well.
Mm. Well, and you and I have spoken on my podcast before, and among the many other things that you do, you were also the textual advisor, I want to say, for Kenneth Branagh's film All Is True, written by...
I was, yes. His film about Shakespeare from 1613 onwards.
And so we can all of our conflicted, complicated feelings about that movie can all be pinned on you.
to some extent. I mean, he asked me fairly late in the day, it has to be said, to be textual advisor, but I did, step up to the mark, and he did consult me daily during the filming process, which was thrilling, wonderful. I'm pleased with that film. I think it's got a great heart, and it's a very brave film in some ways.
And the views of it, this is what I love about CGI in movies nowadays, the way they were able to recreate, early 17th century Stratford was gorgeous.
I love the scene when he's galloping over the bridge at the beginning, dashing from the burnt down globe back to his hometown, and that was. Of
course, that bridge that I've been over so many times as I've visited there, and it was nice to see it sort of in a context like that.
The Clopton Bridge, the Clopton Bridge from the 1490s. It still takes most of the traffic over it daily into the town and out of. And of course, also the glimpse that we got in that opening shot of just how many trees there were in Stratford. It must have felt very wooded. There were 1,000 elm trees when Shakespeare was living in Stratford and growing up here. And
I guess that's something we sort of forget, because we see Stratford now, don't we? As this sort of bustling town with the old and the new and all that sort of thing. But it was, I mean, in terms of towns of the time, how did it compare to as in his day, size wise? What would it have come as, a small one or a big town? What would it have felt like?
Oh, a small town. It had about 2,000 inhabitants.
Yeah. So that would have been a small but significant country town.
Yes,
sort of thing.
Yes, a market town, and it was well placed, between Wales and London. So you're getting traffic from all four corners, if you like, coming to involve themselves in the commerce of Stratford, the markets, and so on.
Well, and when we think of the number of his plays that deal with the themes of the city versus the forest. Yeah. He's very much comparing his two homes, London and Stratford, it seems.
Yeah, it's a great contrast, especially As You Like It. Of course, that has the Forest of Arden, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And the various debates between court and country matters in that play.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I just had the pleasure of playing Duke Senior in the Show Must Go Online version of As You Like It. And that occurred to me that Duke Senior is autobiographical character. One who's very much at home and surprised to discover how much he loves being in the forest.
It's an interesting thought that Shakespeare was banished by his younger brother, Edmund.
Yes. Can you tell us your origin story? How came you to Shakespeare?
Well, I had a whiff of my younger self just a moment ago, and I was recalling Branagh's Shakespeare galloping CGI over the Clopton Bridge, because I'm on my bicycle and I'm 14 years old and I'm cycling from my home in York to York Public Library. Why? Because I know that they have audio recordings on gramophone discs of Shakespeare plays, and I can hire these for 60 pence a disc, and a box of 3 therefore costs me £1.80. And I go into the public library and I take out King Lear, and I take it home and I play it on my parents' record player, and I record it on magnetic cassette tape. Amazing. Whilst following it through with the text of the complete works next to me. And I did that many times between the ages of 14 and 18. In fact, I can tell you I did it 19 times. It was quite a regular thing to be going into York Public Library and hiring a disc and keeping it for a few weeks and then taking it back. And that's how I got to know Shakespeare. I had obviously, I mean, not obviously, but people like to say they had a great English teacher. I did, and it was the great English teacher who inspired me to find out more. and I was delighted to discover that one way of finding out more was through my public library, and listening to Shakespeare, which is still really important to me. In fact, I've been listening to during lockdown. I've been listening to those audio recordings that I hired as a much younger person, because they were all directed by George Rylands, who was known as Dady Rylands, and he was very well connected. He was a fellow at King's College, Cambridge. He had worked for Leonard and Virginia Woolf at the Hogarth Press. He directed all the plays as audio productions. He directed all of them as theatre productions in Cambridge using undergraduates. But the audio recordings he was putting together were for the British Council, and they were distributed internationally. And he was working with the likes of John Gielgud and Peggy Ashcroft for some of them. And then, aspiring undergraduates who included Ian McKellen and Trevor Nunn and Derek Jacobi.
The Marlowe Dramatic Society ones.
Exactly, Gary.
I've got some audio cassettes of those.
There you go. And so they're pro-am, as it were, but in a really excellent way. And he did the whole canon over about 7 years, which is quite an undertaking. And anyway, I think Shakespeare clearly spoken is much to be desired. And
I'm doing something similar in the lockdown because I'm in a monthly Shakespeare book club. And I'm like everybody, I'm pushing off reading the book until the last minute. But I have found it really so helpful to read the lines as I'm listening to an uncut audio version or watching an uncut production. That is so. It just doesn't, or I have to say it out loud coming out of my face, because my eyeballs to the lines, they don't make any sense. But when I hear it, or when I see it spoken, it's all the difference in the world.
So a big difference too between my younger self and now is I can now listen to them confidently without the text in front of me, which is an enormous pleasure. I mean, when this boxed set of CDs, because they were all reissued for 2016, these recordings, and I treated myself to one during lockdown. And when the box set arrived, I started with Othello, and what an astonishing sound! That argument, that discussion, that rhetoric flying, the persuasion, the poison, and I thought, this is like fireworks in my head. It really is. Yeah. And also, I'd want to say that I describe it as like laser beam Shakespeare, because it's just, the clarity is so distinct.
Yes, they didn't mess about with them, did they? They just did
nice
and straight. And
absolutely down the line. And also, Austin, and this too, that there's nowhere to hide in audio Shakespeare. On stage, you can sort of get away with not quite knowing the meaning of the line if you can fudge it a bit. But on audio, people will just stop listening. We're not interested if you don't know what you're talking about.
I just at the beginning of lockdown, I was supposed to have been directing an open air production of Romeo and Juliet, and we couldn't do it. So we decided, we'd already cast it, so we did an audio version of it. I got them all to record their lines in isolation. We did some Zoom rehearsals, and then they sent them all to me, and I put an audio version together, a little bit cut, obviously it was, because it was going to be a cut version for live. But that was fascinating, listening to the actors, listening to the actors doing their thing, and just hearing how well, they had to know it. And yeah, exactly that thing of not being able to hide behind the bells and whistles and tricks that you can do on stage. And also with things like getting some of the jokes and meanings over, the things you can do with a gesture that you now have to do with your voice and with the pauses and stuff. It was a fascinating experiment.
And
yeah,
it wasn't.
Is your discovery of and love for Shakespeare's language what sort of prompted your own interest in poetry?
I think so. I mean, the poetry side of things was already there, and then Shakespeare came on the scene and, changed that very significantly. So I was already writing some poems at school and enjoyed reading poetry. And then it was very much, I was talking to a friend about this some years ago, but I realize now it was me improving myself. It was honest to God self-improvement that was taking place, that engaging with Shakespeare, I knew at some deep level, which I couldn't articulate then, would be good for me, would expand me, would develop me, intellectually, emotionally, artistically, culturally.
And what then brought you to Stratford and the Birthplace Trust, and then how does the facts that we know of his life, how does that inform your understanding of the plays, or does it? Is it a separate thing?
No, it's a symbiotic thing. I'm very interested in biography generally, but so I was listening to the audio recordings and studying Shakespeare at school, and then with our drama class, we were all brought to see A Midsummer Night's Dream, John Caird, 1989. The lovely story about this, which I'll tell you, but it kind of came clearer years on. It was the most expensive school trip the school had ever offered its pupils, and it cost us £13 to travel, including the theatre ticket, to travel from York to Stratford-upon-Avon. And it was this is a comprehensive school in York, and the school allowed us to pay by instalments.
Fantastic. Was that the Claire Higgins?
It was Claire Higgins as Titania.
That one.
And the wonderful David Troughton as Nick Bottom.
The rubbish dump with the.
It's wonderful. And we all spotted David Troughton and thought, who is this? We must look out for him. And of course, he's gone on to play loads of roles in Stratford since, most of which I've seen. Yeah. And he, so I left this letter from the school saying about this trip to Midsummer Night's Dream on the kitchen table, which is where school letters went. And I thought, there's no way my parents can afford to send me to Stratford at that price. And years later, my mother said to me, we saw that letter on the kitchen table and it was obvious you had to go. So there I went, and it was a marvelous production. It was a wonderful introduction to Shakespeare on stage, and it excited us very much. We all had to come back and write reviews of it. And that was also, along with me reading the plays and listening to them, it was like, oh my goodness, I must see as much Shakespeare as possible now. So that got the ball rolling. And the following 2 weeks later, I came back to Stratford with my mother and my sister from York on the train, and we visited the birthplace, because we hadn't done that with the school. And I went home full of Stratford and said, we must go and see the birthplace. We must go back to Stratford. It's wonderful. We even booked to go again to the theatre, but in fact that didn't happen because of family illness. But I took them around the birthplace, and they say now it's as if you knew all about it. I didn't at all. I'd never been. I was discovering it with them, but was just so thrilled to be there. And we walked out to Anne Hathaway's cottage before having then to catch the train home, because we were only there for the day. I've still got some photographs of that trip, and still like to think about it, because it was me really becoming an independent Shakespeare person, in all sorts of ways.
And that was also an incredible time for the productions. At that point, it was a real golden age. I mean, I remember that was a couple of years after I started going to see everything they did. My first one I went to was the Jonathan Pryce Macbeth. That's what switched me onto it, and I was seeing everything at that point. So that was about 3 years before, I think, and there was so many stunning productions at that point in time at the RSC.
And also this was under it was the end of, was it the end of Trevor Nunn's artistic directorship and the start of Adrian Noble's?
It was Adrian Noble. Yeah, he was.
It was definitely Adrian Noble in the 80s, wasn't it? And through the 90s.
Yeah.
And I really rate Adrian as a director.
Yeah.
I thought because he just understood Shakespeare so much and knew the plays and wanted to tell the stories really clearly.
Having discovered him via, in live via the Royal Shakespeare Company, how thrilling is it now to be affiliated with the RSC and seeing everything they do? And I imagine getting backstage glimpses of their process.
Well, I mean, that has been a great pleasure over the 25 years I've lived in Stratford, seeing, as you say, everything they do. And talking about it freely to friends and colleagues and students, and since 2001, since I started work for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, I mean, little did I know as a 15-year-old that I'd be working there full time after having visited the birthplace that sunny Saturday, and there I am, and regularly student groups from all over the world come and see the productions, talk about them. The cast, some of the cast come in to answer questions. I've just chaired hundreds of those sessions over the years with actors and other theatre crew, and one never tires of it because the individuals themselves are always bringing something of themselves to it, so it remains both critically compelling and artistic at the same time, with creative opportunities.
Does the Birthplace Trust and the RSC have an official relationship?
No, we're both separate charitable trusts in law, so we just we've always worked closely together. I mean, I like to say that the supreme expression of the partnership goes definitely back to just before 1964, when the Shakespeare Centre was built, and the Shakespeare Centre was built especially to bring together the libraries of the Royal Shakespeare Company, or what was the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. It was an amalgamation of books and papers, which is why the centre was built, and that's marvelous. That means we've got one of the greatest Shakespeare collections in the world is in his hometown. And as head of research, I regularly involve myself with that and commission research projects from it, work in partnership with universities, have PhD students of my own, organise talks, conferences, publications around those activities of the Birthplace Trust and the papers and so on, the archives and the interest. And a lot of that is about the biographical side, but not all of it.
Oh, that was going to be my next question is when you say research, you're researching his life, his productions, it's all of that, yeah?
It is. I mean, there's a lot to enjoy on this Shakespearean journey, and one's got to sort of organize it to some extent. So it's very much about Shakespeare's life and times, Shakespeare's locale, and what makes the Stratford and the Warwickshire part of it special, and then the afterlife, the after effects of the work, because in the collection we've got many expressions of, from artifacts through to papers, paintings, books, novels, poems, whatever, which express that ongoing engagement with Shakespeare through different media.
Can you talk at all about how the facts of his life or the world in which he lived informs or can inform one's understanding of the text, or vice versa? Well,
I've just recently been working on this book, which has just appeared, All the Sonnets of Shakespeare, which is it's a beautiful book. It's from Cambridge University Press. And look, it has a gold ribbon.
That's how you know it's good, Paul.
So you can't lose your place. And it's all of the sonnets in chronological order. It's never been done before. I co-edited it with Stanley Wells.
Oh, and so you've renumbered them, or
well, we've taken the numbers out, and they've now got little catchword titles such as Gary mentioned Romeo and Juliet a moment ago. We've interspersed chronologically the sonnets from the plays.
Oh, wow.
So on page 89, This one's called Two Households, which is the beginning of two households both alike in dignity, because the prologue to Romeo and Juliet is a sonnet, as is the chorus to Act 2 in Romeo and Juliet, a sonnet. So from 154 sonnets in 1609, you've now got 182 sonnets.
Oh.
And I mention this because two of the sonnets, you talk about the life and the work, two of the sonnets are written by Shakespeare, as it were, while he's riding his horse. And these are sonnets number 50 and 51. They're a pair. And one of the things I've especially noticed working on this book is how often Shakespeare writes a sequel to a sonnet. And there are 19 pairs of sonnets in the 1609 collection. And then there are mini sequences of like 3, 4 within the wider collection. Definitely the 1609 collection is not a sequence. It's a collection with mini sequences in it, and as I say, 19 pairs. And this pair of sonnets is written from horseback. And one of the things we've done, so I won't read the sonnets themselves. I mean, I could do, but we've produced a little thumbnail sketch, summary of the content of the poem at the foot of the page, as well as at the back of the book, full prose paraphrases of every sonnet in the book.
Oh,
because, well, many of them are difficult poems. And as we were working on them, Stanley said, these are really difficult poems. I said, Stanley, if you and I are saying that, what are the readers thinking, really? So we decided that we were going to give readers as much help as possible. And, no other edition of the sonnets we were using really properly told us what the poems meant.
I'm so glad you say this, because, people, love the sonnets and go on about the sonnets, and, yeah, I love some of them.
So here are our thumbnail summaries of sonnets 50 and 51. Sonnet 50. I journey away from you sadly, and even my poor horse seems to know that I do not want to leave you. That's sonnet 50 in a nutshell. Sonnet 51 in a nutshell is, I depart from you slowly, but when I return, my horse will not be able to gallop fast enough. In fact, I will let him walk back and run more quickly back to you on my own. That's the summary of Sonnet 51. So why do I mention this? Well, because those are personal poems. That's a man who obviously was thinking while he was on horseback and wanted to write two sonnets about it. We know Shakespeare commuted between Stratford-upon-Avon and London regularly. He had the largest house in the borough of Stratford New Place, where his family lived. And, you're not going to own a house as lovely as that and not spend any time there. And anyway, it was a place where he could write and properly focus on things away from the bustle of London. So I also think, as a bit of a creative writer myself, and thinking about how I'm going to finish or work on a sonnet as I'm standing in the post office queue, that's what poets do. They think about poetry while they're doing other things, whether that's gardening, and I think on horseback. And, with the trot of the rhythm, the I am of the horse's footsteps, I think Shakespeare did a lot of his thinking about speeches and about plots, and yes, about sonnets, while he's on his horse, really. So I think, and Bruce Smith has written a book about the importance of the horse and travel and meters and verses and so on. And not a book, maybe it's an article. But anyway, Bruce Smith has worked on this area. I once heard him do a fantastic talk about it at UCLA.
Well, and I love, I love that idea that the I am is like a horse hooves, because as we know from that documentary, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, with the coconut shells, ka-bum, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. That's a sonnet. Wow.
There you go. And the fact that, the sonnet is self-reflexive, because if he's writing on a horseback, the sonnet, as it were, the scene of the sonnet takes place while he's riding a horse. So that's interesting too. That's as self-reflexive as, many of the moments in many of the plays when we're suddenly aware that we're we're watching a theatre production.
Well, and I love two other things. One is this: I feel like at some point on this horseback journey, he went, "No, hang on, I got to stop and write this down. This is too good. I don't want to lose.
You don't want to forget it, right? So,
don't want to forget it.
So therefore, he had writing equipment with him. You know, portable Shakespeare.
Portable Shakespeare, potable Shakespeare. And the other thing I love is that, and this is something you and I have discussed before, is this your work there at New Place. And this idea of Shakespeare being the first literary commuter is a new idea and reshapes the kind of conventional understanding or thinking that Shakespeare moved to London and the Globe burned down and he retired to Stratford and it was boom, boom. But you think there was much more back and forth.
Well, you know, Austin, you've very nicely and affectionately called Stanley Wells and me the Batman and Robin of Shakespeare studies. So I'm going to give Batman the full credit for Shakespeare's literary commuter, because it was Stanley Wells's phrase from 2002 in his marvelous book called Shakespeare for All Time, and he was the first to use the phrase, the first great literary commuter, and that absolutely got the ball rolling for thinking again about what New Place represented in Shakespeare's life, what it meant to him,
doesn't it? That he would have done. Does. I don't understand why anyone would have thought anything. You know, it's this sort of narrow thinking before that he'd just go right in London. It's like it makes so. And those of us who work freelance and you know, you need a quiet place to go. You're not going to do it in the bustle of that. So it makes so much sense that he would go home, write a bit there as well. They weren't two separate parts of his life.
No, and as far as we know, New Place had something between 20 and 30 rooms.
Mm.
So, well, and I also like the idea that Ben Elton wrote the script for All Is True, but it was really Ken Branagh's movie. But Ben Elton also created the lowly, cheap sitcom Upstart Crow, which I think is terrific.
I think it's a documentary practically there. I feel that's so much how it would have been.
And he gets it right. Shakespeare's constantly going back and making
complaining
jokes
about commuting.
Yeah, and in Upstart Crow, of course, they're all living in the birthplace, which they would have done before New Place came on the scene.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's an idea too that Shakespeare was a striver. He longed to be better than his father, or to acquire the title,
the coat of arms,
the coat of arms that his father was denied.
Absolutely, but also he had to be a striver partly because he'd made a mess of things by accidentally, one supposes, impregnating Anne Hathaway.
Right.
And because that removes from him the standard career trajectory of apprenticeship into trade, craft, you know, like all of his peers, or most of his peers, he completely, because you couldn't be married and an apprentice. So it ruined his prospects in that way. It was an extremely significant thing to have happened, especially he was only 18 when that happened.
Sad for him, good for us. Yeah.
You know, so it changes everything. So I think that made him into a much freer operator that had the maneuver, because he had to have the maneuver to strive.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about, my wife and I have talked about this because we're in lockdown, and who knows when and if and to what level the theater industry has been changed. And we've been saying, well, God, maybe we should just retire to Stratford and hoard grain. Maybe that's a smarter idea.
Hey, you should do that, but you have to make small beer from the malt. You can't just, you know, it's the reason why you have it. And also, right, the amount of his malt was not as large as some people were hoarding.
Well, indeed, I have to think that any beer I made would be quite small.
People frown on the hoarding of malt, but actually, when you put it into the context of the wider town. You know, they had a household to run, and there was a malt business in Stratford, so you know you've got to bring in the money somehow, haven't you?
Well, and the joke that is made, and certainly I've always made it, is that we know 5 things about Shakespeare and all the rest is speculation, but which is an exaggeration. But we know so much about his world that informs the things that we do know about Shakespeare.
It's true, and that's one of the great gifts to Shakespearean biography, that we can know so much about how people lived, the clothes they wore, how they behaved. We have eyewitness accounts of all sorts of kinds, don't we, from the period? So we can easily, as it were, slip Shakespeare's life into that wider context. And, you know, there's been a lot of, one of the pleasures of a new Shakespearean biography is how that biography is going to portray the world, the life energy in which this work and this life takes place.
Well, in your new book about the sonnets feels biographical.
It is, right, because one of the things in putting them in chronological order, what we've removed is the fictional biography of which we all know about the sonnets, about the fair youth and the dark lady. All of that's gone, we hope for good, because it was never there in the first place. It was brought to the sonnets in the late 18th century, and
imposed upon by people
imposed on
to
them,
create a narrative.
and it's ingratiated itself very much into Shakespearean biography. So rather than biographers looking at the sonnets differently, they've just set out assuming that there was a fair youth, that there was a dark lady, and then set to answer those questions within the biography. So that bit of literary criticism has had a great effect on Shakespearean biography, and we hope we've absolutely uncoupled that in our new approach to the sonnets. And what we've been trying to do is modernize the way in which we think about Shakespeare's life in relation to his work. And in chronological order, and when you realize that they were written over about 30 years, this is not someone who's writing a sequence trying to tell a story. This is someone who's using the sonnet form, not all the time, but a lot of the time, to work out personal thoughts, feelings, write the truth as poets write. And, you know, Stanley and I have been bold enough to say we actually believe what Shakespeare's writing when he writes it. And, you know, that is our assumption. And for some people that's naive. Actually, I don't think so. I think it's where poetry starts, and I think it's where Shakespeare's sonnets start. And then let's have a conversation, as it were. So we're thrilled that we're thrilled that we've produced something which we can confidently say we think is groundbreaking as an approach to Shakespeare's sonnets.
Wow, I can't wait to read it. And in our book, our irreverent reference book, Reduced Shakespeare: The Complete Guide for the Attention Impaired Abridged, we actually say we conclude our section of the sonnets by admonishing the reader: you must never come to the sonnets with an open mind. You must come with theory.
That's it exactly, right. That's what we've been challenging.
That way madness lies.
But, you know, you just get the impression and the new arrangement helps this, especially by removing the numbers. It's extraordinary what not having the numbers at the top of the sonnets mean. They're all easily traceable, of course, through an index, and every number is at the foot of the page where it is in the quarto of 1609. So you can, you know, reassemble the 1609 order from our book if you so wanted to do that.
How did you find out?
They just become much more. Their personality just becomes much more apparent when they've been uncoupled like this.
Right. How did you find out the chronology?
Well, we are walking. No, that's not the phrase. We are sitting on the shoulders of giants for that one. So we're using other people's excellent research, especially the work of MacDonald P. Jackson, University of Auckland, who has done lots of stylometric tests on Shakespeare's use of vocabulary in the sonnets and mapped that across the plays, which can be dated, and has come up with a theory. You know, we believe it to be true, but it's a theory of the order in which the sonnets were written. But critics for many, many years have thought that the order in which they were printed in 1609 was not the order in which he wrote them. And so, just in a nutshell, the later printed in that collection were the earliest ones he wrote. So sonnet 127 to the end are the earliest. So that already throws open the chronology, doesn't it?
It does. And am I right in thinking that Shakespeare did oversee the publication of the sonnets?
No, we don't. Nobody really knows that. But
okay.
I'm more and more of the view that he didn't oversee them. That they were personal poems. That he actually didn't want them to be published. And actually, Ben Elton and Ken Branagh are onto this when they address the sonnets in All Is True. That you know, they personally expose love affairs, and I think they well, we write a little bit about this in the book, but the media have rather gone for it over in the UK. They show Shakespeare to be bisexual, which the traditional, as it were, story applied to them from the 18th century. The irony is that also reveals a bisexual Shakespeare, but as it were a fictional one. We've, as it were, revealed the real one by removing the fiction. So, sans doute, I honestly think that this is a bisexual personality who is genuinely troubled in working out how he feels about men and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's what's lovely about him in every way. He's complicated. And that's what his plays and his sonnets are revealing, are complications.
I was wondering, Austin, whether they one of the things that people have been saying for many years about.
Stop asking about my sexuality. I'm tired of answering those questions. It's nobody's business. Oh, sorry. Well,
I meant about Shakespeare's genius. But I want to relate his genius to his sexuality, because I think that when we say, "Oh, he saw two things at once," "Oh, he always gives us two answers," and you can't separate them. There's always the bifocal might relate to the bisexual.
Absolutely, that makes
sense. And I find that quite interesting. I just that's an interesting potential correlation.
And it's inherently dramatic, that struggle, between two people or between two sides of a person. Is very dramatic and very compelling, dramatically, theatrically.
And I just think we mentioned Virginia Woolf earlier. There's that lovely moment in A Room of One's Own when she sees a man and a woman getting out of a taxi, and the taxi then surreally becomes a brain to Virginia Woolf, and she talks about it as being the man-womanly mind, the male and the female in the brain. And then she mentions Samuel Taylor Coleridge as having said, Shakespeare had this man-womanly mind. And it's in
and it's in the plays too, with all the twins.
Yeah.
And the women disguised as men, and we're attracted to the men, but we don't know why, because they're really women. But these confused, conflicted feelings are throughout his style.
They are the love triangles, and there are three love triangles in the sonnets, which we've sort of noticed afresh in the new arrangement. And they may not involve all. Who's to say that they're about the same people? We don't know. We just don't know. So whereas they've been assumed that about the Dark Lady and the Fair Youth, well, they might not be. They might be about three different triangles.
Well, anybody in the theater knows what it's like to get a crush on your co-stars and to engage in showmances. I can't believe that Shakespeare was immune to the showmance.
Do you know, all these years, Austin, and I've never heard the phrase showmance. I love it.
In fairness, I believe I have coined it, or at least
I'm going to use it all the time now.
As are we all, I think.
It'll be in the OED before you know it, Austin.
Finally.
Attributed, we hope.
Yeah. First used on this
massively viewed.
This is fascinating. I love this. The only thing that could make this conversation better is if we were in the Dirty Duck.
Yes.
Well, if you were in the Dirty Duck, then I would read to you the Love Triangle sonnets. So just for the viewers and the listeners, they're sonnets 40, 41, and 42 is one love triangle. 133 and 144. Sorry, 133 and 134 is another love triangle, and then 144 actually describes a love triangle.
Paul, thank you so much for doing this, and until I can buy the next round at the Dirty Duck, I'll just say great to see you, and thank you so much again.
Well, we'll drink deeply again someday, Austin. Thanks very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Gary.